Hello, welcome to Miniature Realms. My name's Stuart, and I'm a little bit obsessed with Warhammer, the Old World at the moment. It started with collecting a dwarf army for Warhammer Fantasy, putting a few painting tutorials together, and most recently embarking on building a Bretonnian army, hopefully to have some of it ready for the launch of the game, whenever that is. As part of a recent video, I put together some test paints for my colour scheme and asked if anyone would be interested in a painting tutorial for a Knight of the Realm, and that's what we're here to do today. But before we get started, this video is sponsored by Draco Studios, whose latest Kickstarter, Dragon Bond Battles of Valerna, starts on the 6th of June, link in the video description. Battles of Valerna brings the rich fantasy universe of Dragon Bond to your tabletop. The adaptive gameplay allows you to fight fast and furious battles or to immerse yourself in a full-on war game. With Battles of Valerna, the choice is yours. Epic battles await as gigantic models can be pitched against heroic units, giving players great variety and scope when it comes to army building. The wargame is also completely modular, which allows you to swap the heroes in command of your units, letting you expand your army and giving a multitude of options to personalise your troops. Dragon Bond Battles of Valerna is a 3D printable wargame for 2 or more players that utilises a unique fatigue system, enabling players to make the choice between pushing their units to exhaustion or saving them for a potentially perfect opportunity. Players can choose to Dragon Bond their mighty dragons and generals, making both even more powerful. This comes at a cost, however. If either is killed, both are lost. With gameplay developed by a team including Alessio Cavatore, a legend within the wargames industry with a background that includes Warhammer, Warhammer 40,000 and the Lord of the Rings strategy battle game, Battles of Valerna adapts to your playing style, giving you the ability to wage quick and fast-paced battles or immense in-depth wars. Dragon Bond Battles of Valerna is the latest addition to the Dragon Bond franchise, with products including a board game, RPG, comics and a host of miniatures. And back to the job in hand, miniature primed and ready to go, and I wanted to look something like the test piece that I did and showed off in the previous video. I pretty much got the colour scheme down. I did check back on the previous painting tutorials that I did to make sure I wasn't mixing any colours up, and I got myself ready to go. So the miniature has been primed black. It looks very white with these lights for this video. It's been primed black. There's a zenithal top-down highlight, and then I have dry brushed over the top as well to pick out a few of the edges, almost like slap chop plus upgraded. And what I want to achieve here is a way to glaze over the top of the miniature. I like to use contrast, express colour, army painter speed paints to put my base coats down. I find it a very pleasing way to paint. I like the way that it goes over the sort of the pre-highlighted miniature and gives you already some natural highlights and shadows, and I find then that it's less painful to do further highlights afterwards. Gives you more layers of highlighting, and all round is a nicer experience. So first up, I'm starting with the horse. There's not much left of the horse showing, and I'm using hardened leather from Army Painter Speed Paint. Now this is from the original lots. It's one of the colours that does reactivate slightly, so you have to be careful what colours you paint over the top. The colours I'm going to use are colours that won't reactivate with it, or at least they won't show. If you're looking for an alternative, then Gore-Grunter Fur from Citadel is fantastic. Very, very similar colour. I just really like the way this Army Painter Speed Paint flows, and it just looks really, really fantastic over the pre-highlighted miniature. Now we move on to Citadel Contrast Cygor Brown, and I'm using this here for the hair on the horse. So essentially it's just his tail, but there is a little bit of fur around the hooves as well. So now on to some Vallejo Express colour, and this is Omega Blue. This forms the basis of all the blue areas on the Knight's livery. Now I'm taking my time here, making sure I don't put blue in any wrong areas. I've got the first miniature to keep checking back on, to check my placement. There's so many areas that are blue cloth. You've got the badges, the livery badges on the sides of the horse's overcoat, as well as the overcoat itself. Half the shield. I've got to look at his clothing as well, whether I quarter it or do it by layers. You can obviously mix it match between the different horsemen in your Knights of the Realm unit as well. But for this one, I matched it almost entirely to the initial test piece. And now for the other main colour, I'm using Contrast Nazdrag Yellow. Now, as you can see, there's lots of white left on the miniature, and most of this will be covered in yellow by the end of it, saving the lance and parts of the armour and the sword, etc. So again, it's kind of fitting the yellow in the opposite parts to the blue, being careful to try and keep it in with the areas that I've designed it to go into. The whole idea of the preparation of the miniature in this way, with this sort of zenithal pre-highlight and the dry brushing and things, is that you really get the benefit from the underpaint. And if you get too much of your paint on areas you don't want it, then you lose that effect and you have to go back in and tidy it up before you add your next colour. That's probably one of the things, if you base coat in this way, that you do have to be quite neat. Now I get out my trusty favourite contrast paint, Garagax Sewer, which is an awesome brown, which is fantastic for leather colours and things like that. There's quite a lot of leather on the horse, so you've got all the strapping around the sides, you've got the scabbard. If you wish to do it that colour, I'm going to do my metal. There's parts on the stirrups, sword hilts, the handle around the lance if you so wish. There's quite a lot of areas that you can use as brown leather. Now, next up, Contrast Skeleton Horde. Now, I had a bit of a camera issue here, so you can't see where I put it, though it's mostly on the lance here, which you can see the effect there over the pre-highlighted model. There are some further highlights which boosted that a little bit, and there's also some, looks like, straps at the front and back of the horse, which you'll see in later pictures, which also use this. Now here I'm using a bit of Contrast Black Legion to paint in the hooves. Now I think with horses the hooves are generally derived from their hair colour, so these are probably too dark. By the time I've based the miniature, added weathering powders and things, it doesn't really show up too much, and I wanted to differentiate them slightly from the main horse's colour and the colour of the fur. Next up, we head to Scale Colour for Black Metal. This is Scale 75's metallic range, and I'm going to be hitting up most of the metallic areas on the miniature itself. There will be some areas that I do paint in gold. I may even hit some of those areas now a little bit and paint over them afterwards, but essentially we are looking at the sword here, we're looking at the entirety of the armour, the rim of the shield, we're looking at the barding on the horse. There's lots of little metal bits around, so it's well worth double checking you haven't missed anything. There's little bits of chainmail barding around the horse, at the back and down near the feet. There's a small metal area around the tail. Just a few little bits and bobs that you may miss, so it's well worth having a double check. Sticking with Scale Colour Metallics, we have Necro Gold, and this is a beautiful, dull, desaturated gold. I really, really love it. And I'm going to be using it for a little bit of trim on the knight. The main one being on the top of his helmet, the big shiny part, so that's all going to be gold. But I'm also going to paint a little panel here and there as gold. So on the sword, part of the hilt, there's a little bit on the front of the horse as well that I might paint in gold, and a little bit on his dagger as well. Here we have some good old Nuln oil. It's the new formulation which I do like, and I'm going to be using it all over the standard metallic parts of the miniature. Now we begin the highlights with model colour royal blue. Now I usually do a bit of a jump off point in your miniatures, and this one I think it deserves a little bit more care, so you could stop at this stage now before any highlights and it would look cool on the battle table if you based him, but we're going to crack on and won't dwell on that too much. So the royal blue first is giving us our first layer of highlights above the natural highlights that were there from the Zenithal highlight stage and the contrast glaze over the top. Now there's quite a lot of work to do here, and I've thinned my paint nicely on my wet palette. I'm trying to leave plenty of the darker shade underneath while picking out some of the higher areas, but also bearing in mind that there is a further blue highlight which is even brighter, so just trying to make sure that I don't take away too much of the shadow or blot out too much of the area that I wish to highlight later. Just take my time, work my way around the miniature methodically, making sure I'm not missing anything and keeping it as neat as I can. Now on to that next highlight, and I'm using Fantasy Games range. This is also scale colours at scale 75, and it's a Marth blue. Now this I'm going to be using a lot more sparingly, edge highlights in some areas and picking out the very topmost areas of the blue just to make it really pop. So take your time. You can always add more much easier than you can take it away. If it goes too bad, you can always glaze it back afterwards. But have some fun, take your time, work your way around the miniature again, and just try and really make those edges pop. And while we started with contrast paints over a Zenithal highlight, this is very much more old school traditional style painting now, so add as much detail as you like or feel comfortable with. How much time you're willing to spend on these miniatures versus the amount of time you want to get them on the tabletop. So back now to the Express Colour Omega Blue, which we started with the base colour, and I'm just going to be thinning it 50-50 with some water and adding some glazes back in. You see here I'm putting it at the top of one of those livery badges just to reinforce the shadow, and I've got the highlights at the bottom there. It's a light choice that I've chosen. Yes, the bottom of the shield of that area is slightly tilted forward, but you could do it the other way if you so wished, but it does produce a pleasing effect as it goes from light to dark. Now back to Citadel, and we've got a base paint and it's Avalanche Sunset. It's a very good strong pigmented yellow, doesn't require thinning quite a lot to get a nice smooth finish, and we're going and doing what we did with the blue now but with the yellow. So I thin the paint, I'm going in at the edges first, building in where I want the highlights to be, also being aware that I'm coming in with an even brighter yellow for those top highlights in the future. And for those top highlights, it's a Citadel layer colour and it's Phalanx yellow. This is a nice, bright, strong pigmented colour as well. Also requires some thinning, but I'm just going in and picking out those topmost highlights the way I did with that bright Amath blue for the blue stages, and really making the miniature pop. So again, working my way around the miniature methodically and taking my time. Now it's time to start highlighting the horse, and we're going for model colour orange brown, and this is a perfect highlight as a first stage over the hardened leather from Army Painter Speed Paints. And while that Army Painter Speed Paint first version, not the 2.0, reactivates slightly, it doesn't really seem to, or it's not noticeable with this colour over the top, so that solves a problem. If I wanted to put a white or something over the top, I'd have to seal it with a bit of matte varnish first, but this paint just seems to complement it really, really well. And for the next stage of highlight, I'm using model colour light brown, and it's just a perfect further highlight on top of the orange brown and that hardened leather. Here I'm using model colour flat earth as a highlight for all the leather parts. In most cases, just working around doing a subtle edge highlight on all the leather strapping and on the sides of the dagger hilt, not forgetting the knight's gloves. Continuing with model colour, I'm using chocolate brown to highlight the horse's hair on his tail and on the feet. Now onto a Citadel shade and its Cryptek Armour Shade gloss, which I'm going to use on the gold areas. Now for my favourite bright silver, which is Game Air Silver, and I'm going to be using that to dry brush on the tops of the lance tip, around the edges of the shield, on the barding, basically any metallic areas, mixture of gentle dry brushing and edge highlighting. Back to scale colour metallics, and this is Elven Gold, and I'm going to be using this to highlight all the golden areas. So a bit of a mixture here of straight up painting, dabbing it on, and a little bit of light dry brushing, just trying to stick to those raised areas. Now for some model colour dark sand. I'm going to be using this to highlight the areas that we originally painted in Skeleton Horde. So these are those kind of straps at the back which lead to some sort of livery badges which were missed out of the video earlier on, and I'll also be using the same colour to add some highlights and some marks to the edge of the lance. Now we're moving on to some of the final stages. Here I'm just gently brushing on a little bit of gloss varnish where I'm going to apply some decals. This really helps them to adhere. Now you have to let the gloss varnish dry first, but to get the best results out of them, they stick better on gloss, and I use Microset and Microsol, which you will see me using later, but there is a tutorial on my channel on adding decals to miniatures, and I'll pop a little link in if I remember, because it's well worth checking out to get to best results. So while that gloss was drying, I started to slap on the earth texture for the basing. And then gluing on some chunks of Katsan cat litter, which I'm using as rocks in this army. With the gloss now dry, I start to apply the decals, and you can see blurry in the background there the microset and microsole. The microset helps stick it to the surface, and the microsole helps almost melt the decal down slightly so that you get that painted on look rather than seeing the seams and edges. Now for some Express Colour Black Lotus directly over the Katsan litter pieces, and it just produces quite a nice effect, and it's no need to prime it or anything beforehand. Occasionally a little bit of the paint will sink in through the holes. Obviously it's absorbent, so you just need to go back with a brush and touch it up, but once you've added other effects to the base and things as well, I think they look pretty cool. Had to get Agrak's Earthshade on the model somewhere, and here it is going on the texture base once it's fully dry, of course. And once that's fully dry, I brush on some dry pigment. This is like sienna. Adding a few tufts, I'm using Autumn 2mm tufts from War Painted Figures. I'm finishing off with some thick European mud from Vallejo. This is more of an effect, I believe, than a basing texture. And if you whack it on thick, it tends to look like wet mud, which is awesome. I like the idea of it all being churned up by the horse's hooves. Sponge on a little bit of Rhinox hide onto the shield to make it look like it's been chipped and pockmarked. And now that those decals are fully cured and set, I'm just adding a little bit of matte varnish to seal them in and get rid of any of that shine from the gloss. Now the obligatory black rim on the base is for me, none of those fancy colours, I don't like any of that stuff. Obviously do what you like for your army. And I couldn't resist adding a little bit of blood effect with blood from the blood god on the shield and a little bit on the lance there. It is Warhammer after all. And there we have it, one finished Knight of the Realm. And I think, if I'm honest, while recording for the video, it probably took me about 4 hours. I think if I wasn't stopping and starting and playing with camera angles and things, I could have taken an hour or so off that. Maybe can get it down to 2 hours, but I think more likely 3, which is a lot for a single miniature. Maybe it counts as 2 on a horse, I don't know. But if I'm only painting 6 in this unit for now, which will probably end up growing, I imagine, depending on the rules, maybe growing up to 12 or something, is not too many, considering it's not a unit of 40 goblins or something like that. So I'm comfortable with that, and I'll make back the time on the peasant archers and the men-at-arms. I'm pretty pleased with the way it's come out. It's not the highest standard ever. It is a good tabletop standard, very much a nice eye-catching army, but it's not going to win any prizes. There's definitely lots of scruffy bits on it, which you'll be able to see because it's all recorded in 4K. But again, as I said, I'm pretty happy with it. I'm looking forward to getting the full army fielded on the table. I'm really interested in hearing what you're working on. If you're working on armies for the old world or fantasy, any edition really, find out what you're doing. Are you rebasing? Are you using your movement tray conversions? Or are you just waiting and seeing what happens? There's obviously been more news recently about what factions are going to be in the game at launch, which I won't get into on a painting tutorial, but it's all good fun things to talk about. If you've found this video before you found any of the other Warhammer related videos and you've watched all this way to the end, it is well worth checking out the other videos in the series and related to it. I'll pop a link to that playlist in the show now. And if you've enjoyed the video, please do consider giving us a like. It does help it get seen by other people and lets me know that I'm doing a good job. If you like what other things you see on the channel, please do consider subscribing as well. It's really, really nice to see so many new subscribers recently because of the old world stuff. There's going to be a lot more of it intermingled with the previous recorded programming, which I had. Lots of historical bits as well. I've got a new Flames of War project on the way, so there may well be something to suit everyone. But thank you very much for watching. Take care, and I'll catch you soon.